Every 6 months or so, Sony puts out a new flagship phone that looks more or less identical to the last one, and the new Xperia XZ1 is no exception, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth your time. Sony's design language hasn't changed much at all since the first Xperia Z back in 2013, and frankly I'm getting a little bored with it, but one of the perks of sticking with the design for so long is getting to continually refine it, and this is easily the best hardware Sony has ever put on a phone. The XZ1 has a full metal build that wraps all the way around the sides with a nice matte finish that does a great job at hiding fingerprints. There's a door for the SIM tray on the left side of the phone, and the power and volume buttons are conveniently laid out along the right side, as well as a physical camera button, something I wish every OEM would build into their phones. The power and volume keys are a bit mushy for my taste, but that's not nearly as annoying as the fact that the fingerprint sensor Sony integrates into the power button is still disabled in the US. Without an alternative like iris scanning, this seriously slows down the authentication process on the lock screen and in sensitive apps like bank accounts. On the bright side, I have to give Sony props for the XZ1's audio experience. While the headphone jack doesn't offer a fancy DAC like on LG phones, it's at least still there, and the XZ1 is one of the very few phones in 2017 to still feature front-firing speakers, which sound great and kind of make up for the phone's giant bezels. In between those bezels is a 5.2-inch 1080p LCD display with Sony's Triluminos technology and support for HDR. It's fine, but it doesn't get very bright for use outdoors, and maybe I just spend too much time with Samsung's oversaturated AMOLED panels, but none of the 3 available color profiles looked good to me at all. Luckily, the rest of the phone's specs are pretty great. There's a Snapdragon 835 processor inside, 4GB of RAM, 64GB of storage with microSD expandability, Bluetooth 5.0, and it's even IP68 water resistant. On the software side of things is where the Xperia XZ1 really stands out, namely because it's the only non-Google production phone that's already running Android 8.0 Oreo. With that modern software comes modern features like picture-in-picture video and notification dots, and Sony's own software is light enough to give a fairly close to stock feel. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of preloaded apps though, because, well, there are. Sony includes a number of apps that you may or may not find useful, including Amazon, PlayStation, Xperia Lounge, and more. I wish you could uninstall more of them, or at the very least hide them in the default launcher, but you'll probably want to download a third-party launcher anyway. Now, one of the more interesting parts of the Xperia XZ1 is its new 3D creator software that scans objects, faces, or even your entire head to create a 3D model. You can share these models on social media or even buy a 3D print, and Sony is working with developers to incorporate its scans into mobile games. When you're not using the XZ1's 19MP camera to scan your head, it takes some pretty darn good photos too. There's a little too much over-sharpening going on, which is pretty typical of Sony phones, but the camera produces much better colors than the XZ Premium I reviewed back in the summer, and it even does pretty well in low light. It's not quite up to par with the cameras you'll find in the Galaxy Note 8 or LG V30, but this is easily the best camera of any Sony phone to date. There's also a crazy slow motion feature that lets you shoot at 960 frames per second in 720p. You need a ton of light to make it work, and it doesn't record sound during slow-mo captures, but it's still a super cool feature that I'm glad to see return from the XZ Premium. One thing that really surprised me about the XZ1 was its battery life. I regularly saw over 6 hours of screen on time despite a measly 2700 mAh battery. This is yet another example of the importance of software optimization combined with a power-efficient chipset and a 1080p display. Look, the Xperia XZ1 is the best phone Sony has ever made, but given how far they've been trailing behind the rest of the industry, that isn't necessarily a raving review. For between $650 and $700, the XZ1 is priced the same as the Galaxy S8 and Pixel XL, both of which have better cameras, better screens, and working fingerprint sensors in the US. Still, if you value things like a physical shutter button and super slow motion, and you don't mind the large bezels, the XZ1 is definitely worth giving a shot, but I'd still probably wait for the price to go down a bit before you do.